So I'm going to talk a little bit about who was Frank Fenner first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about me, but I'm not going to give you Midwifery 101 or Maternal Health 101. I'm going to take you on a different kind of journey as well. So as Brendan said, Frank Fenner was born in 1914. He died in 2010. He studied medicine at the University of Adelaide and has a diploma of tropical medicine. We'll come back to that. He's served in PNG as an army officer, and then went to Weehai, and has had a number of other roles, as Brendan has just explained. When I was researching for this talk, I found a fantastic interview with Frank Fenner on the Australian Academy of Sciences website. I'm not going to read the whole interview for the whole of my 50 minutes, but I want to just read some of them because they're kind of pretty gorgeous and I think really relevant to us as an institute, for us as researchers, and for us in the work that we currently do. So bear with me while I tell you a bit of the Frank Fenner story. So this is Frank's words, because it's written from him. So he says, "I was a resident in 1939 and our residency finished in February, and I was the only man, there was only one man in our year who didn't enrol in the Army or the Air Force." This is 1939. "I had the idea that the war would be fought in the tropics, so before I joined up, I went to Sydney and did a diploma of tropical medicine using the £200 bonus that the hospital provided for residents who stayed the full 12 months. £200 to go to Sydney and do his diploma. I've made very few decisions in my life, but one that was really sensible, leading ultimately to being a malariologist in the Army, and this opened up my future career." So we all make decisions along the way that we kind of just make because we make them, but often they pan out in the long run. "When malaria cropped up as an important disease in Syria, virtually none of my colleagues knew anything about it, whereas I knew what malaria parasites looked like. I got involved in lab work there, later being in charge of a laboratory at one of the Australian General Hospitals in Northern Australia, and then shanghaied into Papua New Guinea as a malariologist. I went to PNG as a field worker and had a marvellous time looking after not just malaria but scrub typhus, dengue, any arthropod transmitted disease. It was very interesting. My wife was also involved, being a blood transfusion expert who had learned from a Melbourne surgeon how to do direct transfusions. She used a machine given to her by the Melbourne surgeon to transfuse 200 millilitres of blood from a person who'd just been infected by a mosquito to a non-infected person. Very early it was realised by chance that in doing that you could transfer the sporocytes up to about half an hour after the mosquito bites, and then you couldn't transfuse the disease until the blood form appeared a week later. This was the origin of many ideas in the history of malaria. So I think it's important to think about his wife at this point, and I'm very conscious of thinking about the people who stand alongside us in our careers, the people who support us, the people who make sure that we can do the work that we do, and forgive us when we do crazy things like Zoom calls all night or other things that many of us do. So Bobby Fenner also has a number of other strong connections with me. She was a nurse. She was a nurse in Western Australia, and she went away with the first contingent of nurses to the Middle East. And she was at the hospital in Kantara in the desert when Sir Ian Wood was a senior physician in terms of blood transfusion. And she moved into that and became an expert transfusionist. Because the hospital couldn't get any saline, my wife undertook to prepare sterile saline under those desert conditions. She was very good, he admitted, and got recognition as an associate of the Royal Red Cross, which was very rare for a person who's not an administrator. Nearly always such recognition goes to matrons, not hands-on people. And because of her expertise, she went on to direct transfusion in the research unit and also dissection of mosquitoes further on in her career. She worked with me in the lab, and we had some children. I love the way he just did that as a throwaway kind of line. So she looked after them. But also, especially when I was director of the John Curtin School, she maintained open house for all the staff. She's been a tremendous support to me right throughout my career. And now we come to Sir Frank McFarlane Burnet. Frank Fenner came back from Papua New Guinea and went to Weehai to work with Burnet. Burnet was a dominating scientist in the sense of when he was working on influenza, he wanted virtually everyone in the institute to work on influenza, which was quite small, the size of about a department in most places, to work on influenza. That doesn't sound familiar, does it? But he appointed me to work on different things, and he gave me a completely free go. All the papers that I wrote were under my own authorship, without Burnet as a tag-on. And we remained friends all of our lives. When he and Linda, his wife, went to Britain for 9 months, we took care of their children. Their eldest son dropped out of university during this time. The eldest daughter got engaged. So we had a very exciting time in his family. I'm not sure that many of us would take on our director's children at this stage for 9 months. So he worked on a whole lot of other interesting things. He went and did a fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute in 1949. He says, to give myself something original, I took over with me some strains of a bacillus which had been isolated at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne from some patients in Barnsdale. And I have visions of a little small esky going through, probably on a long boat trip in those days. I developed an assay for mycobacteria, and such a colony count had been very difficult, and my method was subsequently used a lot by other people's groups, and obviously spent a lot of time thinking about tuberculosis, and probably has changed a lot of our thinking now and directed a lot of our thinking. He also used a mouth pipette. He says it was dangerous because every time you used a mouth pipette, as we did in those days, you received a little aerosol of tuberculosis bacteria. And there were several cases of laboratory tuberculosis, but fortunately I never got sick. I can't imagine what Marguerite would think about that in terms of OH&S. He says, I had this marvellous opportunity of a great experiment of nature in which I was able to follow the way in which the myxomatosis virus changed to become less virulent, and then some rabbits survived. And those who survived were genetically more resistant, so you could breed resistance. You got this interchange, this balance between virulence and host resistance, and this was the study of changes in virulence. So again, some really relevant things for what we work on today in this institute. And finally, the smallpox eradication. The smallpox, he says, the smallpox eradication program was set up in 1967. The director of the smallpox eradication unit realised they had to be quite sure whether there was an animal reservoir of the smallpox virus. And I was a member of the small committee of virologists that met for the first time in Moscow in 1969 to discuss whether this virus might constitute an animal reservoir of smallpox. I later became the chairman of the Global Commission for the Eradication of Smallpox, a long-sounding title for the commission and a very challenging role for me. And as Brendan said, he was the one that stood up and said that smallpox had been eradicated. And this is a statue that, for those of you who ever travel to WHO will know, it sits in the garden right outside the doorway as you walk into the WHO headquarters, and this is about the eradication of smallpox and the vaccination that happened, and it's a very emblematic statue that I always look at. So Frank Fenner did a whole lot of other things after that time. He became the president of the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses, and those of you virologists in the room or online, I'm sure, have seen his books. Wrote many books and had many awards. Apparently the smallpox and its eradication book weighs 3.8 kilograms, the size of a small baby. So an enormous body of work over a lot of years. The other rather lovely thing I found in the annals of archives of Frank Fenner is that the royalties from his books he donated to various organisations and the ANU to set up fellowships, to set up awards for other people to get scholarships, to get opportunities, to go to conferences in the future, and I think that's another really special part of his legacy. So, what can we learn from Frank Fenner? And while I was reading his story, I was really reflecting on where we all come in our careers, whether we're researchers, international development specialists, technical officers, support, professional staff, all the things in the Institute that bring us together. And these are some of the things, I think, and you might have your own kind of thoughts about what we can learn from the people who've gone before us. I think taking opportunities and being brave. I loved it in his story that he talked about things being a marvellous opportunity and made big steps and made big decisions that maybe if he'd thought harder about mightn't have happened. And I think that's the same for all of us, and certainly in my career. My decision to become a midwife was in a pub late at night after I'd had a crappy day as a nurse. So not a very thoughtful decision, but one that I have never regretted. I think finding smart, good and fun people to work with, and I'm going to come back to that, but because for me that's a theme in my career. Finding smart, good and fun people to work with is absolutely critical for all of us. We work a lot of hours of the day. We have to have good people to work with, and we have to make sure that they are be able to flourish as well. I think Frank Fenner collaborated across disciplines, and I want to come back to this theme as well, that moving outside our lane. We might stay in our lane as our expertise, but we will never do things alone, and we have to make sure that we work with other people. Thinking about the world around us, and I guess in terms of the Institute, we're really good at this. We're good at making our eyes a bit wider and making sure we think about the world. We have fantastic offices in Papua New Guinea and in Myanmar, and I really hope some of you are on the line today. A big shout out to our colleagues in PNG and Myanmar. But we also work across the region and in other continents as well. And so thinking about the bigger world that we live in is really important. I think there's no doubt that you have to work hard. I'd be fibbing if I said that it would, work-life balance was an easy thing and it was all a simple operation. We all work hard. I think Frank Fenner definitely worked hard to write those books. Think about it's before the PC. He would have written them all on a typewriter or handwritten them, and some poor person had to write them all out on a typewriter. So we have to work hard. That's, I think, a strong message from Frank Fenner. And finding good support in our personal lives. So support at home, people who love us and care for us, people who make sure that we can do the things we want to do and we think are important to us, I think is a really critical part of being successful. So I was going to spend the rest of the talk talking a little bit about my story, about, I hope, some messages for you about this notion of being successful. And I still think it's a rather weird word to use, but I haven't put it in inverted commas on that slide. But our plan, and I've just sat with the 20-odd staff of mine over the last 3 months and done our professional development reviews and where we want to go to and where's our plan. Often in our heads, it's pretty straight line. It's pretty straightforward. We want to get there. We've got a 5-year plan or a 3-year plan. The reality for all of us is not like that. And certainly the reality for me over my 25, 30-year career has not been a straight line to success. Stuff happens. Life gets in the way. People don't like the things they were doing and they want to do something else. A new opportunity comes along, or there's an illness or other things that happen in our lives. So success is not ever the straight line that we think it is in our plan. And it certainly isn't a straight line. When people hear someone give a presentation, it sounds like they woke up one day and they decided to do all these neat things and suddenly they got to where they were and it was a nice, straight, ordered line and nothing messy happened along the way. Plenty of messy stuff happens along the way, and we would all be fibbing to ourselves if we didn't admit that messy stuff happens along the way. But we kind of have to roll with the punches in the messiness. And in my career, the messiness has bred opportunities. And so thinking about how to take those opportunities and how to make the best of those opportunities, I think, is really important. And the other line that isn't there is one that goes off in a complete trajectory. And that's actually also fine. That you were going on this nice line here and then someone went over there and you went and did something different. And actually that was the best thing that you did. So there's lots of ways to be successful in inverted commas. So how did I get here? I'm a girl of the colonies. I was born and brought up in Zimbabwe when it was called Rhodesia. And so I'm very much a colonial girl, and I come from colonial heritage. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story because I think we all bring our story to work. We all bring our story to our whole selves to work, and we should use our whole selves and our whole stories in our work. And it kind of sometimes explains why I think the way I do and the things that I'm committed to and I'm determined to make a difference of. So my father was born in England, and after the war, his father was killed right at the end of the war. But after the war, his mother shut up shop in England. They had a big house that got lost. They ran out of money at some point after the war, invested in the wrong things. So she bought a coffee farm in Kenya and moved the family, only my father, to this coffee farm in Kenya where he grew up very much as a colonial. So this is in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, a very colonial history. He also did some work as a jackaroo in Australia at some point, but essentially was a colonial of Africa. As Africa became majority rule, many people, including my father, moved down. So they ended up going down the continent until they got to Rhodesia, which had not become majority rule. My mother, on the other side, comes from Indian Raj heritage. She was born in South Africa just because the boat happened to be passing. So the ship from England going back to India just stopped. Her mother got out, had the baby, got back on the ship, and they kept going. And she was brought up in India, up in the north of India in Simla. Her father was a magistrate in the British Raj. And when partition happened, they also went on the move. So they went across to Iran and then down into Tanganyika in those days, through Kenya, and eventually also ended up in Zimbabwe. So there's sort of this colonial route that people take. So I'm not an anti-colonialist, but I'm a conscious person who thinks about the impact of colonisation on the world that we live in, and that explains some of the things that I do and why I think the way I think. My other heritage is that my family have some experiences. My mother didn't get an education because her father thought that girls didn't need education, they were just going to get married, and that's all they needed to do. So she went to school for 2 years only. She self-taught everything else. And she was denied a scholarship. She was awarded a scholarship to go to the National Academy of Art in England as a 17-year-old, and her father said that was unnecessary. She was just going to get married. So my sense of injustice about that is enormous, and the opportunities that women have missed out on along the way because of their patriarchal heritage, I guess defines some of the things that I do in my life. My father also has quite a sad story. His mother was the victim of domestic violence in Kenya and ultimately died as a result of that on my parents' honeymoon. And so my sense of injustice around family violence, about gender-based violence, again about the patriarchy not treating women well, is also very strong. And I tell you those two stories because I think they're important to understand where people come from, and you all have the same. You all have heritages and stories that are why you are today, and I think we should just own them. I've only actually started talking about these things in recent years, mostly because I've felt more confident about my place in the world. So we came to from Africa on a boat. It was the last voyage of a very crummy Italian steamer that went off to the dockyard to be scrapped after the trip. We came with no papers. We had a letter from the Embassy of Australia in Pretoria in South Africa that said, these people have a maternal relative, you should let them in. We had no passport. Zimbabwe by then, Rhodesia, had been kind of excommunicated from the empire for not agreeing to majority rule. And so we had our passports taken away, we had no money, and we had this letter from the embassy in Pretoria. And I just think the embassy, the guy at the docks felt sorry for us. We were 3 little kids. We were standing there with our hula hoops. We couldn't go back. We kind of couldn't go back to anywhere. And it was the time of Malcolm Fraser and enthusiastic migration and refugee commitment. And they let us in. And the man at the dock said to my father, well, you shouldn't really come in on a maternal relative, you can only come in on a paternal one. And I remember even at 11 being outraged. Why was my great-great-grandmother less worthy than my great-great-grandfather, who happened to be accidentally born in Australia? So again, this sort of sense of injustice and that things had to be better. I'm really conscious that if we came to Australia under these circumstances now, we would be sent for offshore processing. And so the world would be quite different. So thank you, Australia, for letting us in. The guy at the docks, I remember him saying, come in, work hard, be good, get your citizenship the day you can. And so on the 3 years to the day, we have citizenship certificates, and my siblings and I have all done very well subsequently. I had a pretty ordinary education. You can see, for those of you in the room, I wasn't very good at sewing hems. It was a particularly bad hem of that dress. I went to a state school in Queensland, and it was all fine. But again, it was quite gender aligned. So I was smart, and they said, well, you really should do physics. I was the only girl in my class who did physics and advanced maths. Most of the girls did secretarial college. I'm actually cross that I didn't do the secretarial college, because I would have loved to touch type. And I think touch typing now is a very important skill we should all have. But I left school kind of, even in those days, and this is only in 1982, nice girls like me did nursing or teaching. It didn't seem to be another option. And so I decided to do the nursing option and went to, in those days, a apprenticeship-based model. So my academic journey is not very academic. I'm a hospital-based nurse. We have 3 years where we were treated pretty badly at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, a very big hospital, largest hospital at that time in Australia. I was one of 1,500 student nurses. They gave me a uniform that said N Homer, and I timidly took it to the matron and said, you've got my name wrong. My name's Caroline Homer. To which she said that you don't have a Christian name for the next 3 years. Forget about your name. Your name is Nurse Homer, and just behave yourself. And so an incredibly hierarchical way of being in the world. And my aversion to words like junior and senior, which some of you have heard in various meetings, comes from this experience of always being seen as junior and reasonably worthless and probably pretty invisible. I remember in my first term in one of the wards, it was very scary. It was full of seriously big matrons with very big white hats and white shoes, and they were terrifying. Someone came to me. I was hiding in the pan room, because that's what you did when someone arrived in the ward. And she said, come out, Nurse Homer, and smile. And I thought, oh God, I'm going to be killed at this point. But I did. I just smiled because I didn't know what else to do. And she said, great, you go. They need a photo of a bright, young, smiley nurse. And so I ended up being the nurse on the wall somewhere. But that's the sort of highlight of my nursing career, which was not very strong. I then ended up doing midwifery, as I said before, after a conversation at a pub late at night. What are you doing at the moment? I'm not really doing anything. Why don't you come and do midwifery with me in Sydney? Yeah, sure, that sounds good. So we went and did midwifery. Again, a hospital-trained program. So I still don't have an undergraduate degree. I have a certificate in nursing and a certificate in midwifery. And at one point, there was a time when I could have done an undergraduate degree, but it would have taken me 6 years, and I really didn't see the point at that time. There was quite a difficultness about getting people into degrees. So I left midwifery reasonably uninspired. My training wasn't very good. It was sort of ordinary. I caught a lot of babies. I did the sort of things that you did. I won both academic and practical awards, but I didn't find any passion about midwifery. But very early on, in my first year after graduating as a midwife, I went to Malawi. and worked as a midwife in a small mission hospital in the north of Malawi. And this is in the early 90s when HIV was rampant. We knew that 30% of the women having babies in our hospital were HIV positive. The maternal mortality rate was about 1,000 per 100,000 live births. I had never even thought that a woman would die in childbirth from my training in Australia, let alone having a ward full of women dying in this very small hospital. So it was a huge wake-up call to what the real world was about, and a huge understanding about the injustices and the inequalities that live in the world. And also a bit about the craziness too. So this little nursery, which is a really beautiful nursery, the babies were in little boxes. These days we do kangaroo mother care and give the baby to the mother. But these babies were in little boxes, and we had metal hot water bottles that went under the boxes to keep the babies warm. And there was rules like you had to change your shoes when you went into the nursery. So everyone took their shoes off and put another pair of shoes on, but nobody washed their hands. And I could never work out why the shoes were important, but the hands weren't. So I think in some places over the years we give away practices and ways of doing things that are not very sensible. And most of my career has been spent unravelling some of those practices that are not very sensible, I think. And we have to think hard about what we transport into the countries we work in, what we give away, because it may not be taken up the same way that we think it should, or used historically in the same way we think it should. I got sorted as a midwife in Malawi. The Malawian midwives were incredibly generous and incredibly good about teaching me to be a midwife. I think they must have been horrified. I couldn't suture, I'd never delivered a twins baby, I'd never delivered a breech baby. I didn't really know how to do anything on my own. I couldn't drag out a baby with a vacuum extraction on my own. I think they thought I was totally hopeless, but they were very kind and very generous, and I think after the year I was there, figured that I was actually quite useful because they'd taught me stuff, thank goodness. But I then went back to Australia, renewed enthusiasm about midwifery, and then that sort of sorted out my international career as well. So I've worked in lots of hospitals over the years as a midwife, in a labour ward for a long time. I worked at St Vincent's Hospital in the early years of HIV trials. I worked as a clinical trials nurse with David Cooper in those years of starting the new treatments for HIV, and when I look at where that's come to, that's a pretty amazing journey as well. I found a home hospital at St George Hospital, which is a small district hospital in the middle of Sydney. It's now a very big district hospital. And there I met mentors who encouraged me to do a PhD. So remember, I still don't have an undergraduate degree. Along the way, I managed to do a coursework master's degree in child and family health. But I met the first professor of nursing in Australia, Professor Leslie Barclay, who kind of just wrangled a PhD for me with the university, and she just dragged me along. And I actually didn't know what a PhD was, or what one would do with one, or why one would need one. But I'm very grateful. I'm going to talk a bit more in a minute about mentors and being supported. I also found UTS along the way, University of Technology in Sydney. That was my home then for the next 15 years until I came here to Burnet. And it was at UTS that I started working internationally, originally in Papua New Guinea and Samoa, and then across the region, and then a bit more broadly now, as I'll explain in a moment. But I think you take those opportunities. I was a UTS student. They asked me to teach a course on evidence-based practice. I thought, oh yeah, I could do that. So I went along and taught that, and then there was another thing, and before I know it, I was the professor of midwifery. And in those days, I was 2 years graduated from my PhD and got my professorship job because there were only 4 of us in the country who had a PhD as midwives. So sometimes those moments in time, you're just in the right place at the right time. And for many years I felt guilty about that because I'm an imposter, and we all have imposter syndrome. These days I just think I was in the right place at the right time, and I was lucky. And now I try and think of opportunities to put other people in the right place at the right time to get those opportunities, because I feel that's my job now. I was super lucky to meet Brendan in Papua New Guinea about 7 years ago, and maintained in contact. And as I said, sent Brendan an email at one point. I was encouraged to apply for an NH and MRC fellowship. I didn't even know what that was. And I didn't think I had any chance in hell of such a thing. But the university was fantastic. They said, we will help you. We will help you do it. Sit with us, we will help you do it. And then I was shortlisted, and then I was interviewed, and that was absolutely terrifying. And somewhere along the line, I got the fellowship. And then I realised what it meant. It meant freedom to one degree. It meant that I could go somewhere else with most of my salary and do something different. And I'm super glad I made that transition to Burnet now 5 years ago. So some of the things I'm proud of along the way, some research that I did in 2016 and 14 and then 16 was around the impact of midwifery. I've been banging on about for years about we need midwives, that every woman in the world needs a midwife. Some women need a doctor too. Some women need a mental health worker. Some women need other things. But every woman should give birth with a midwife. And we were trying to unpick, if that was the case, would that make a difference to maternal deaths? Would that make a difference to stillbirths? And would that make a difference to neonatal deaths? And this was a collaboration for the Lancet series that we were invited by Richard Horton to do in about 2012, which took 2 years to do, actually understanding what is midwifery, what are midwives, where are they in the world, and if you had them, would they make a difference? And so that study is now one of my most cited papers and does get used all the time to think about what would you get if you had midwives everywhere. A few years later, the paper, The Potential Impact of Midwives, was published in the Lancet Global Health, and we kind of repeated the same analysis but with better data. In the years between 2014 and 2020, much better data existed globally, and so we repeated it all and showed essentially the same things. And those findings, so that if 95% of women had a midwife, you would reduce maternal deaths by 85% around the world. You would reduce stillbirths by 85%. You would reduce neonatal deaths by 85%. And that then became a bit of a game changer globally. That data is now being used all over the place to build midwifery, to strengthen capacity, to ensure that every woman does get a midwife with her. And we're working with WHO, with UNFPA, with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and with other agencies to try and think about how can we strengthen midwifery. The other reports there are technical reports, and I put them up. There are reports that I'm super proud of. I was the lead writer on most of those reports. They're not peer-reviewed publications, although we have produced peer-reviewed publications out of all of them. But in terms of reports that get cited a lot and get used, they were a really important thing to be part of, and I'm really proud of the work that we did. The 2014 report was the first one I was involved in, and I remember distinctly in 2011 someone from WHO saying to me, do you want to be involved in this report? We're going to look at the state of the world's midwives. We're going to look at 58 low to middle income countries. And at that time, I was super busy. I was running a midwifery program. I had 2 curriculums on the go. I had a whole bunch of students, and I said no. I was too busy. And I regretted that the moment it came out of my mouth. And so as soon as the next one came along, I thought, bugger it, I am not saying no, I don't care how busy I am. And that led to a whole lot of things subsequently. So, not saying you should say yes to everything. I actually say no to more things I say yes to these days, but sometimes those opportunities come, and it might not sound absolutely perfect, but might work out in the long run if you take a chance. So for me, that was a really pivotal moment about thinking, yes, I should do something about that. But the other things I'm proud of is my real commitment in strengthening capacity of others. I feel I've had huge opportunities in my career to be strengthened, to be capacity built, to be enabled, And so the work that I do now is very focused on trying to think about how do we support other people. And so these people here, this is in the UNFPA office in Cambodia, where I've done lots of work over the last 20 years. These colleagues, some of them hopefully are online, now lead their own work. They now go into countries, support countries, provide technical advice, do their own work. Felicity Copeland, Rachel Smith and Cara Blackburn. And we work very closely. This is Catherine Bream Kampong, who's the Regional Advisor for Sexual Reproductive Health in Bangkok for the whole of the Asia-Pacific region for UNFPA. And I think our capacity strengthening, our capacity to work collaboratively as an institute and as individuals, I think is really important. So I'm really proud of that piece of work. I'm also really proud of developing PhD students and supporting PhD students and walking alongside them and then letting them go. And it's lovely to have some of the PhD students that I'm currently working with in the room. I think if I add them all up, there's 50 PhD Masters Honours graduates that I've supported over the last 20 years, and super proud of every single one of them. And every journey is a privilege to walk alongside with a PhD student, and then none of them are straight lines. And none of them are what they thought they signed up to, they end up at the end. But I think that's a really joyful part of being people in our roles, those opportunities to walk alongside and to enable and to engage. So for me, actually, if I think about what I'm proudest of my career, it's the achievements of others that maybe I've had something to do with, that they've then gone on to do great things themselves. So I just wanted to talk for the last little while about what makes a successful career, because I guess the Frank Fenner Award is given to people who are theoretically been successful and have done some stuff. And I think all of us can be successful and are successful in our own ways. And again, success is not a straight line either. There are lots of ways to be successful. I just happen to have taken this path. For me, it takes a village to be successful. When I came to Burnet, there was Josh and I in 5 years ago, and we kind of found each other. And I'm sure Josh is online. He's in Western Australia at the moment. He rang me at one point. I was just in the process of moving from Sydney to say he'd met Brendan and he thought there might be a job going at Burnet. And what did I think about that? And I'd met Josh once at WHO, and I remember meeting him then thinking, I want to work with you. You've got a very good brain. And you might be quite a nice person too. And so we joined up forces, and there is no way one can do success on your own. Find people, find your people. So in the last 5 years, we've gone from that to that, and some of you are in the room who are on that. We now think that's the size of a group because we can't fit any more pictures on the page. And Zeshi Fisher, who looks after this page, thank you, Zeshi, for continuing to squeeze people, getting smaller and smaller. But this is a fantastic group to work with, and this is the working group that I co-lead with Josh. And of course, the broader institute is wider than this, and there's a whole bunch of other people who couldn't possibly fit on this page. But I think that sense of having a village, and it takes a village to be successful. And no one will ever be successful if they just stay in their own lane on their own. I think it's really important to find good people to work with. And I've been really lucky over the years, maybe a bit strategic as well. You won't always like everybody you work with, and there are some people you're going to have to work with who you don't like, and that's just the harsh reality. But for the most of the work you do, find good people. And then you might work out how to manage the less good people in whatever good is in your view. Both at UTS, at Burnet, University of Melbourne are my most recent stories of finding good people to work with. And finding things to do that are social and that are a bit fun. And these photos down here are from the Pacific Society for Reproductive Health conference that was held in Papua New Guinea just before COVID. And we didn't realise that we wouldn't ever come together again for another 3 or 4 years. But some fantastic people along the way, and really finding good people to work with is super important. I put these other logos up here because the other thing I think has been good, has contributed to my success, is is my opportunity to work in volunteer organisations. So professional organisations, the Perinatal Society of Australia and New Zealand, the Australian College of Midwives. I've been president of both those societies over the last decade. And then obstetric emergency teaching also is an obstetric emergency teaching program. We have taught midwives and obstetricians and general practitioners essentially from all over the country, travel to all states and territories and in Samoa and in PNG and on the Thai-Burmese border. And those jobs are not paid. Those jobs are jobs you do on the weekend or at night. But if I think about the opportunities that those jobs, those roles have given me and the people I have met and the things I've then had a chance to do, I really encourage you to join your professional society or be part of any volunteerism. I'm a big supporter of volunteerism, however it plays out. And for us, many of us, it would be in our professional societies. So I think that's a way you find good people to work with as well. I think finding things to work on that matter, and that's different for all of us in this room. And for me, it's always been about maternal health. It's always been about mothers and babies and about strengthening the midwifery workforce. And whether that's clinical practice, which I loved, teaching and learning, which I also loved, research or development, I think finding things to work on that matter to you, and hopefully they'll matter to the world, because then they'll have impact. And what we really need, obviously, is to have impact, to make a difference to maternal health for me and newborn health. It is a sad reality that the world will not meet the SDG goals for maternal health. We have to get to a maternal mortality ratio of 70 per 100,000. At the moment, it's going in the other direction. It's about 200. It's going to take a lot to get from 100 to 200 down to 70. And in countries like Papua New Guinea, we don't even know what it is. It might be 230, it might be 500, it might be 700. In other countries in our region, we have similar challenges. Afghanistan is another country that brought its MMR down from 900 to 300. Who would know what it is now? So finding things to work on that matter, and finding people to work with who you can work with and you can make a difference, I think is really important. For me, it is about maternal health, it is about newborn health, and it is about stillbirths. A woman dies every 2 minutes in the world due to childbirth. So while I've been prattling along here for 45 minutes, that's a lot of women who've died in childbirth around the world. And that number isn't going down. That number is, in some countries, going up. Stillbirth is an enormous yet overlooked tragedy. And we are working very hard in Australia around breaking the silence around stillbirth. We now need to work globally around breaking the silence around stillbirth, removing the stigma that stillbirths happen, ensuring that women get bereavement care and their partners get supported and looked after when they lose a baby, and then working out how to prevent it. Really, 2 million deaths a year of stillbirths is a lot of sadness. That's a lot of tragedy. And every one of those babies gets remembered by their mothers. And any of you who have ever experienced a stillbirth or been with people who've experienced a stillbirth, it's not something you get over and you move on. It's something that lives with you forever. So that's a lot of sadness to think about. And of course, childhood deaths. So 2.3 million children dying in the first month of life in 2021. The vast majority of those deaths occur in the first 24 hours. So it's a very dangerous time to be a brand new baby, and if you're not going, you may not survive. So that, for me, they're the three kind of time points to really focus on that matter. And then the work that we've been doing and that Josh leads in our group is around preterm birth. If we can reduce the rates of preterm birth, we will make a huge difference to neonatal deaths. And if we can reduce the rate of preterm birth, that's also a lot of much healthier babies going forward. And for every stillbirth, every neonatal death, what generally happens is women want to get pregnant again. And that's a natural, normal thing. But that puts them at risk of dying of a maternal death all over again. So if you can reduce stillbirth rates and newborn death rates, you reduce maternal deaths, because women aren't pregnant again so quickly. So they're all intertwined and a really important piece of the work that we do. Of course, deaths are not the only thing we care about. We care about morbidity. We've just released, Josh led a series on maternal health this week, a Lancet series on maternal health, showing the long-term impacts of childbirth that are mostly ignored and mostly left behind. So again, that's a really important thing to work on, and I'm really looking forward to working in that space going forward. This is a great quote by Professor Fatala, who was the president of FIGO, the International Confederation of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. He said it in 2006. It's still absolutely relevant. Women are not dying because of untreatable diseases. They are dying because societies have yet to make the decision that their lives are worth saving. We have not yet valued women's lives and health highly enough. And I think that is super relevant to the work that we do. It's really important around equity, around justice, around impact. And I think it kind of, for me, this is one of the quotes that I'm always using and always thinking about value and about equity and ensuring that mothers and babies get the best start to life. And so the other piece of work that I've spent my career in is about the global shortage of midwives. And this is research from the State of the World's Midwifery and the Lancet series on midwifery, where we showed a global shortage of 900,000 midwives. This was in 2021, but the data was collected before COVID. We think it is worse now. And we're just working with the Gates Foundation and others to try and replicate this analysis to really work out where we're at now. And the research that I've done is the little thing at the bottom, that midwives would save a projected 4.3 million lives a year by 2035. And again, if we had midwives, we would save lives. If we had midwives and we looked after them and we supported them and we enabled them and we gave them a mobile phone and an ambulance, we would make a huge difference in almost all countries. So this is a graphic that I got off the internet. Madhu Pai is a professor of global health in Canada, and I think it's useful to think about why we work on the things we work on and what makes a difference. So we work on things because we love them, we're good at them, the world needs them, and we're paid for it. We have to be realistic. We have passion, profession, mission and vocation, and then we have purpose. And I think for all of us, it's kind of helpful to think about why do you do what you do and where would it fit in that Venn diagram, and how would it all come together. So what else makes for success? Being brave when you find yourself out of your comfort zone. I still have imposter syndrome, although I fight hard against it these days. And at one point, suddenly I ended up on big tables. Somehow I ended up at WHO. Somehow I now chair the stage group for the Director General. Somehow I stand on a thing with the Director General at one point just before COVID. This was literally the end of February 2020, and he was walking from a press conference across the corridor in WHO, and we dragged him and said, come and take a photo with us. Again, not knowing that we actually wouldn't stand on those steps again for the next 3 years. I'm very fortunate to have worked with Anne Kelso, and before her Warwick Anderson as the CEOs of the NH and MRC, and being thrust into those positions was very challenging, and I was terrified I still am mostly, but managed to get over most of my fears around chairing those big groups. But being brave and just thinking, right, okay, these are just normal people and I'm just a normal person and we can all do this together. And this is our most recent stage meeting that we had at WHO only a couple of weeks ago, an amazing group of 35 international experts from all over the world worrying about maternal, newborn, child, adolescent health and nutrition. I used to worry that everyone around the table was smarter or cooler than I am, but now I'm relieved. Now I'm so relieved that they are super smart and super cool people, and I often get to direct them or chair them or worry about them or think about them. And I think when I think about the teams we've brought together at Burnet, employing people who are smarter than us is one of the really smart things to do. So smarter and cleverer than us, because they will make it happen. So don't ever be intimidated by the next generation of smart, bright young things, because they want your job, and that's a good thing. And we should be helping them get to the point where they can have our jobs, because we don't want to keep doing what we're doing forevermore. I also think there's a lot of having had fun in the world. Midwives are fortunately a very good bunch of people to go away at a conference and have a lot of fun. Generally includes quite a lot of champagne. But I think not taking yourself too seriously as well, being approachable and being engaged and ensuring that everybody can kind of be supportive. And work-life balance I'm not very good at, but I do walks without mobile phones. I think it's really important that we find mentors and supporters. I've got mentors and supporters in this room, and I'm super grateful to all of you who've been on this journey with me, and many of you online, I know. I think reach out and find mentors. People often say to me, oh, you're too busy. I wouldn't ask you, you're too busy. We love being a mentor. I love when I can talk with other people about the work that they're doing. It really doesn't take very much effort. I've been super lucky over the years to have fantastic mentors, and I never would have done a PhD if Leslie Barclay hadn't just said, oh yeah, we can make that happen, don't worry about it, leave it with me. You should get a letter in the next week or two. Someone who really had my back and really said, we can make this work for you, and I think we can do that for each other, and we can really make sure that each other is supported. I talk a lot about ladders these days, and some of you will have heard my ladder talk. I've got this thought around we all need people to hold our ladders. So as we're going up, whatever ladder of success we're at, someone's at the bottom holding onto it and making sure it doesn't fall over, like we would do if we were gardening or if we were trying to get the leaves off the roofs. So we need ladder holders. So go and find ladder holders, people who are going to have your back, who are going to hold your ladder as you go up the ladder of success. But then the reciprocal is that you must hold the ladder. You must come down from your big ladder and hold that ladder for the next generation to go up. And so that we can all either find a ladder holder for yourself, and you can do that. You can have these at any time in your career. It's not something that is only when you're newly in your career. But we have to hold ladders for others. And I really believe in holding ladders for our peers. So don't wait until there's a hierarchy in the world, which you know that I hate. Holding ladders for one another, I think, is really important. And then living with uncertainty. And we wouldn't work in a research institute, an NGO, international development if we couldn't live with uncertainty. Because most of what we do is uncertain. We're uncertain about our funding, we're uncertain about the next grant, we're uncertain about whether we'll be allowed in or out of that country, we're uncertain about what that country's going to do or want to do or maybe not do at all. We have to live with uncertainty. So we have to find ways of coping with that and not being paralysed by it. And I think for all of us, it's about being a good leader. And I hope that I've been a good leader over the years and will continue to do that. But leadership is not a hierarchical thing either. Leadership is for all of us. It doesn't really matter where you fit on any hierarchical ladder. We all have leadership roles in our lives. And the nourishing of others is the core of effective leadership. And we have to work in teams or set up teams that allows people to flourish. I love the sense of human flourishing, letting other people flourish, not being intimidated by that, but being inspired by that. I think leadership isn't limited to our workplaces, and you all know that. Many of you have other roles of leadership or other avenues of leadership outside your work life, whether it's in your home life or your school life or wherever else you are. I think modern self-aware leaders are much more likely to build inclusive teams when people can show up as themselves. And so I guess for me, the work we've been doing at Burnet around gender equity, around disability, around LGBTIQ, and around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander reconciliation are about enabling people to show up as themselves. We all show up with our own baggage. And that's okay. We have to carry our own baggage in, put it in the corner, get on with our work, but we can't pretend that we don't have our own vulnerabilities, our own limitations, but we need a diverse viewpoint in everything that we do. and that fits with all of those pieces. And I really believe leadership comes from caring deeply about those in our world, and that really fits with the Burnet ethos around a commitment to equity, around a commitment to social justice, and a commitment to leaving no one behind, even when sometimes that's what's going on in the world. For us, in our group, we've really found clarifying our values and ways of working really important. This is something that we developed when I came to Burnet, and we've revised it over the last few years. This is from our group, and we use it with each other around how we should behave with each other and how we should work as a group. And this is not anything magic. It's things like communicate, be respectful, be nice to each other, work alongside, speak up when you see injustices, speak up when you see things that could be done better, do work that matters, enable people to be successful and recognising success. And for those of you interested, it's stuck on my door. You're welcome to photocopy it and use it, whatever you like. So finally, what would Frank Fenner finish on if Frank was here? And I'm very sad that I never got to meet Frank Fenner, but I'm super grateful to have received the Frank Fenner Award this year, and it's a wonderful honour and a fantastic opportunity to talk with you today. I think Frank would say find good things to work on, things that matter, and I think that's what we do at Burnet. We find good things to work on, we find things that matter. Focus on equity, particularly for priority populations. I think we do this really well at Burnet. Our absolute ethos is around equity. Our ethos is around our populations, about where we work, who we work with, whether they're in Australia, in our country offices, or across the world. Take opportunities as they arise. Think about Frank Fenner's marvellous opportunity to go to Papua New Guinea in the middle of the war. Sounds like a crazy opportunity to me, but for him, it was an opportunity that he embraced, and look what happened next. Find good people to work with. Find good support at work and at home. And I think Frank would definitely have said that Bobby and his family became and were that support. And while we all may not choose all to have partners in our lives, or that might not be how our lives play out, there are still ways of finding good support, however you choose to make those choices. I think really important for me when I read about Frank, respectful, humble and generous were words that came out to me, and I think we can all learn from that respectfulness, that humbleness. And Brendan told me a lovely story about when Paul used to pick up Frank at the airport, and they'd go off and have chats about all sorts of things and eventually come back to the Institute and do the proper conversations. But that being interested in people, being respectful, and being very humble. Stepping out of your comfort zone. Frank certainly did that. Imagine going to Papua New Guinea in 1949 armed with a diploma of tropical medicine that you got for £200 and thinking, oh, no one really knows about malaria here, but I know what it looks like. That's a big step out of your comfort zone. And being brave. Keep going and don't give up. The world is big and our lives are long. There are lots of ways to reinvent ourselves along the way. We won't all have one career. And particularly the young people in the audience, you will have more than one career. You will probably have 5 careers, and they will be very different careers. And importantly, take care of yourself. I'm a strong believer in leave and holidays and not working all the time. And the only way I do that now is to go on long bushwalks in places that don't have phone reception. That generally works. I also have a rule, and to those of you online or in the room from my group, you cannot send me an email from the 22nd of December until the 2nd of January, and every email you send, you will buy me a bottle of wine. So it could be very expensive. You can write the emails, but you cannot send them, because I don't want to see emails over that break. We all need time off. We all need downtime, particularly at this time of year. So, thank you very much.